The clock wasn't on my birthday wish list, but it's the only gift I still think about. I've always hated antiques. There's something unnerving about the way they carry pieces of the past with them, like secrets they refuse to share. Maybe that's why I didn't react the way my friends expected when the clock arrived. It was my 25th birthday. My friends, ever the sentimental types, decided to throw me a surprise party at my townhouse. I'd been working late that day, and when I stepped through the front door, they all jumped out, shouting, "Surprise!" I remember laughing, feeling genuinely touched despite the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. They'd decorated the place with balloons and streamers, and the dining table was laden with snacks, a homemade cake, and far more wine than any of us needed. For a while, everything felt normal. The night unfolded in a haze of laughter and toasts. My closest friends, Claire, Jason, and Tanya, had gone all out, even creating a cheesy slideshow of our memories over the years. "You're officially in your mid-20s now," Jason teased, handing me a glass of wine. "Time to start collecting cats and complaining about your back." "Thanks for the reminder," I shot back, rolling my eyes. The mood was light, almost comforting. For the first time in months, I felt a little less alone. But then the delivery arrived. It was nearing the end of the party when the doorbell rang. I frowned, glancing at my friends. "Did one of you order something?" They all shook their heads, equally puzzled. Claire followed me to the door, wine glass in hand, as I opened it to reveal a man in a delivery uniform standing on the porch. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale under the dim glow of the porch light. "Emily Dawson?" he asked, his voice oddly flat. "Yeah, that's me." He nodded and gestured to a large package sitting on the sidewalk. "Happy birthday." Before I could ask any questions, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The package was huge, nearly 6 feet tall, and wrapped in thick brown paper. Claire helped me drag it inside, the two of us grunting as we heaved it through the doorway. "Who the hell sends a birthday gift this big?" Claire muttered, stepping back to examine it. I shrugged, my stomach twisting with unease. None of my friends admitted to sending it, and the deliveryman hadn't offered any clues. "Open it." Tanya called from the living room, the others gathering around with eager grins. With a deep breath, I tore away the paper. Underneath was a grandfather clock. It was stunning, in its own unsettling way. The clock stood over 7 feet tall, its frame carved from dark mahogany that gleamed faintly in the soft light of the room. Intricate patterns of vines and flowers were etched into the wood, their details so precise they looked almost alive. The clock face was made of brass, its Roman numerals bold and elegant. But something about it caught my attention immediately. Above the 12, faint but unmistakable, was a 13 etched into the metal. "That's interesting," Jason said, scratching the back of his neck. "Creepy is what it is," Claire muttered, her expression mirroring my unease. The pendulum, a polished brass disc, swung gently back and forth, even though the clock hadn't been wound. That's when I noticed the note. The note was tucked into the clock's lower compartment, written on parchment so old it felt like it might crumble in my hands. "Happy birthday, Emily," I read aloud. "Follow the rules. A friend." Tanya frowned. "Rules? What rules?" I turned the parchment over, my stomach sinking as I read the list. "Rule number 1, if you hear the bell ring 13 times, hide somewhere safe. Rule number 2, don't throw the clock out of your house. Rule number 3, always wind the clock before midnight. Rule number 4, if the pendulum stops swinging, light a candle and place it in front of the clock. Rule number 5, don't cover the clock with anything. Rule number 6, if you hear whispering coming from the clock, do not respond." "What kind of sick joke is this?" Claire asked, snatching the note from my hands. Jason laughed nervously. "Maybe one of your other friends sent it. You know, as a prank?" I shook my head, a chill creeping up my spine. "I don't think so. None of my other friends know where I live." As the party wound down, my friends tried to brush off the clock's arrival with jokes and wine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The clock's faint ticking filled the silence after they left, each sound echoing louder in the empty house. I sat on the couch, staring at the clock as its pendulum swung back and forth, back and forth. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint but distinct, a mix of burnt wood and melted wax. It clung to the air around the clock, making my stomach churn. I shook my head, trying to push the unease aside. It was just a clock, a weird, unsettling clock, but still just a clock. Right? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the faint ticking of the clock, its rhythm too steady, too precise. At one point, I thought I heard it chime, a low, resonant sound that sent shivers down my spine. But when I checked the time, it was 2:30 a.m., nowhere near the hour. I returned to bed, pulling the covers tight around me, but the unease lingered. I didn't know it then, but the clock had already started working its way into my life. It started the next night. The day had been uneventful, with just enough work emails to keep me distracted from the clock. By the time the sun set, I had almost managed to convince myself that the whole thing was just an elaborate joke. Almost. But as the hours ticked by, and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, my unease returned. It was 11:30 p.m. when I remembered the list of rules. I'd tucked the note into my kitchen drawer, more out of annoyance than any real intent to keep it. Now, though, curiosity gnawed at me. I walked to the kitchen, pulled it out, and reread it under the harsh glow of the overhead light. If you hear the bell ring 13 times, hide somewhere safe. The wording was strange, almost playful in its warning. Who hid from a clock? I rolled my eyes and tossed the note back into the drawer. Whoever sent this has way too much time on their hands, I muttered, heading to bed. I woke to the sound of bells. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a low, resonant chime that echoed in my ears. But as I blinked awake, the sound grew clearer. The clock was chiming. I turned toward the bedside table, squinting at the glowing numbers on my alarm clock. 3:13 a.m. The chimes weren't stopping. 4. 5. 6. My stomach tightened as I threw the blankets aside, padding into the hallway. The sound pulled me like a magnet, growing louder with each step. 7. 8. 9. By the time I reached the living room, my chest was tight with dread. The grandfather clock loomed in the corner, its dark frame gleaming faintly in the moonlight streaming through the windows. 10. 11. 12. Then, a pause. For a brief moment, everything was still. The pendulum swung lazily back and forth, the ticking of the clock steady and sharp. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at it, waiting for something. The 13th chime rang out, deeper and louder than the others. The air grew cold, my breath forming faint clouds in front of me. My legs felt rooted to the floor as a new sound filled the room, faint whispers, soft and indecipherable, coming from somewhere near the clock. I stepped closer, my throat dry. "Hello?" I croaked, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. And that's when I saw it, a shadow in the corner of my vision. It was subtle at first, barely more than a flicker against the far wall. But as I turned my head, the shape grew sharper. It was tall and angular, standing unnaturally still. Its outline seemed to waver, like smoke caught in a breeze. My body screamed at me to run, to look away, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked on the figure, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. It shifted, just slightly, and I saw its head tilt in my direction. The shadows around the clock deepened, spreading across the floor like a black tide. The spell broke as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My heart hammered as I bolted for the hallway, slamming the bedroom door behind me. I threw myself under the bed, the rules flashing through my mind. If you hear the bell ring 13 times, hide somewhere safe. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing against my chest. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I strained to hear past the pounding of my pulse. Nothing. For several agonizing minutes, the house was silent. Then came the faint creak of floorboards outside my door. I don't know how long I stayed under the bed. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the weight of the silence bearing down on me like a physical force. When the first rays of sunlight finally spilled through the curtains, I crawled out, my body stiff and aching. The house felt different, warmer, almost normal. But as I stepped into the hallway, my unease returned. The door to the living room was ajar, and as I pushed it open, my stomach dropped. There were scratches on the hardwood floor near the clock, long and jagged as if made by claws. The pendulum swung gently, its ticking louder than it had been before. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note I'd pulled from the drawer. My hands trembled as I reread the rules, my eyes lingering on the first one. If you hear the bell ring 13 times, hide somewhere safe. I hadn't hidden fast enough. The thought made my skin crawl. What had I seen last night? A shadow? A hallucination? Whatever it was, it felt real. Too real. That afternoon, I called Claire. "Are you sure you're not just overthinking it?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "You've been stressed lately. Maybe you just had a nightmare." "It wasn't a nightmare," I insisted. "There were scratches on the floor this morning. Something happened." Claire sighed. "Okay, but think about it logically. It's just a clock, Emily. How can a clock do anything?" I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the memory of the 13th chime, the icy air, the shadow in the corner of the room, it was burned into my mind. "I think you should come over," I said. Claire agreed to visit the next day, but that night, I was alone again. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing myself into work and blasting music to drown out the ticking of the clock. But every time I looked toward the living room, my chest tightened. The clock seemed closer somehow, its dark frame dominating the space. I tried not to think about the smell, the faint mix of burnt wood and wax that lingered no matter how many candles I lit. When midnight rolled around, I was wide awake, clutching a flashlight like it could somehow protect me. The house was silent, save for the steady ticking of the clock. I forced myself to stay in bed, my body tense with anticipation. But this time, the bells didn't ring. The hours crept by, the silence almost worse than the sound. When dawn finally came, I felt more exhausted than ever, my nerves frayed and my thoughts scattered. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the way it moved, the way the air grew colder when it tilted its head toward me. No matter how much I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, the scratches on the floor said otherwise. And then there was the clock itself. It hadn't stopped ticking since it arrived. The pendulum swung with unnerving precision, like it was counting down to something I couldn't see. I needed answers. The next morning, I found myself in front of an old antique shop downtown. Its sign, Grayson Antiques and Curiosities, hung crookedly above the door, and the windows were clouded with dust. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. A bell jingled as I stepped inside, the scent of aged wood and varnish filling the air. The shop was cramped, every surface covered with trinkets and furniture from decades, or centuries, past. "Can I help you?" The voice startled me. An older man with thinning white hair and sharp, dark eyes emerged from behind a counter. He wore a wrinkled shirt and suspenders, his expression curious but wary. I need some information about a clock," I said, pulling out my phone and showing him the picture I'd taken the night before. His reaction was immediate. The color drained from his face, and his hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses. "Where did you get this?" "It was a gift," I said, my stomach tightening. "Why? Do you know something about it?" The man, Mr. Grayson, stared at the photo for a long moment before answering. This is the Crawford Bellkeeper," he said finally. "Or, at least, it looks like it." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "The Crawford Bellkeeper is a legend, a cursed timepiece from the late 1800s. There are stories about clocks like this, but they've always been more myth than fact." "What kind of stories?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then gestured for me to follow him. In the back of the shop, Grayson pulled out a thick, leather-bound book from a shelf. The cover was worn, the title faded, but inside were dozens of sketches and handwritten notes. This clock was made by a craftsman named Elias Crawford, he explained. He was a recluse, obsessed with the concept of time and its connection to the afterlife. They say he built a series of clocks, each designed to bind restless spirits and prevent them from crossing into our world. But it didn't work, I said, my throat dry. Grayson shook his head. No, it didn't. The clocks became vessels for the spirits instead. And the most dangerous of them was the 13th chime. The 13th chime? I echoed. He pointed to a passage in the book. It described a malevolent entity bound to the Crawford clocks, one that grew stronger each time the rules were broken. They say it feeds on fear, Grayson said, his voice low. The more you defy the rules, the closer it gets to crossing over. I stared at him, my hands trembling. What happens if it crosses over? He closed the book, his expression grim. No one knows for sure. The people who've encountered the 13th chime either disappeared, or worse. The words sent a chill down my spine. Can't I just get rid of it? I asked. Throw it away, burn it, something? Grayson shook his head. The rules are clear, you can't remove the clock from your home. If you try, it'll come back. And it'll be angry. His words settled over me like a weight, suffocating and inescapable. What am I supposed to do? I asked, my voice breaking. He hesitated. Follow the rules. That's all you can do. The antique shop left me with more questions than answers. Determined to learn more, I headed to the Charleston Public Library. The librarian, a kind woman in her 60s, helped me locate a few books on cursed objects and local folklore. I spent hours flipping through their pages, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. One book caught my attention, Cursed Timepieces, Myths and Legends of the 19th Century. The book included an entire chapter on the Crawford clocks. According to the text, the 13th chime wasn't just a spirit, it was an ancient, malevolent force that used the clocks as a gateway. The rules were designed to keep it contained, but every broken rule weakened the barrier. A chilling passage stood out, the 13th chime cannot be destroyed, only bound. To sever its connection to the mortal realm, a personal sacrifice must be made. My chest tightened as I read the words. What kind of sacrifice? Buried in the book's appendix was a list of known Crawford clocks and their last recorded locations. My heart nearly stopped when I saw one of the entries. Location, Charleston, South Carolina. Destroyed in 1952. I flipped the page, my pulse racing, and found a description of the clock. It matched the one in my grandmother's house. My grandmother had owned a grandfather clock when I was a child. I remembered it vividly, the dark wood, the heavy ticking, the way it made the entire room feel colder. But one day, it disappeared. My mother told me it had been destroyed in a house fire, though no one ever explained how the fire started. Could it have been another Crawford clock? The next day, I drove to my grandmother's old house. It had been empty for years, its windows boarded up and its garden overgrown. The lock on the front door was easy enough to pick, and I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay clinging to every surface. But the house felt familiar, like a dream I couldn't quite remember. In the attic, I found it, a charred, leather-bound diary buried under a pile of old books. The cover was brittle, the edges singed, but the pages inside were mostly intact. It belonged to my grandmother. The entries were disjointed and frantic, describing her attempts to contain the clock's power. I hear it at night, one entry read. The whispers grow louder every time I break the rules. I thought I could burn it, but it came back, angrier than before. Another entry caught my eye. The 13th chime feeds on fear and guilt. The only way to bind it is to confront it. A sacrifice must be made. I closed the diary, my hands shaking. The clock in my grandmother's house had been another Crawford bell-keeper, and it had nearly destroyed her. Whatever sacrifice she'd made to contain it had cost her dearly. Now, it was my turn. I didn't sleep the night I found my grandmother's diary. The words on the brittle pages echoed in my mind, The 13th chime feeds on fear and guilt. The only way to bind it is to confront it. A sacrifice must be made. I tried to make sense of what that could mean, but every possibility filled me with dread. Confronting it sounded impossible, let alone making a sacrifice. And yet, the clock continued to tick, its presence in my home undeniable and inescapable. It started the following evening. I'd spent the entire day pacing the house, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to leave the clock unattended, even though its ticking had grown louder, filling the house with a relentless, steady rhythm. Just before midnight, I noticed it. The pendulum had stopped swinging. My chest tightened as I remembered Rule 4. If the pendulum stops swinging, light a candle and place it in front of the clock. The candle sat untouched on my kitchen counter. My mind raced, trying to decide what to do. The logical part of me screamed to follow the rule, but another part, angry, rebellious, tired of being controlled by this thing, refused. I knelt in front of the clock and reached for the pendulum. "If you want to swing, I'll swing you myself," I muttered, gripping the brass disc and giving it a push. The moment I touched it, the clock began to hum. The sound was low at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, vibrating through the floor and walls. I backed away, my hands trembling, as the humming transformed into a series of erratic chimes. The clock's hands spun wildly, the Roman numerals blurring together as if the mechanism inside had gone haywire. The air in the room grew colder, and the faint smell of burnt wood returned, stronger this time. Then came the whispers. They were louder than before, no longer faint or muffled. They surrounded me, coming from every direction, filling the room with a chorus of low, urgent voices. "Emily, why didn't you save me? Run." The last voice made my stomach twist. It was Tyler's voice, the voice of my best friend, the boy who had drowned in front of me all those years ago. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but the whispers only grew louder. And then I saw it. The glass face of the clock caught my eye, and my breath hitched. A figure stood behind me, its form tall and angular, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its glowing eyes burned into mine through the reflection, its clawed hand reaching toward me. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the clock, the glass was covered in scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way through. I fled the living room that night, locking myself in my bedroom. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every gust of wind outside felt like a sign that the clock was coming for me. When I finally emerged the next morning, I froze in the doorway. The clock wasn't in the living room anymore. It was standing in the corner of my bedroom, its pendulum swinging lazily, its ticking impossibly loud. Panic surged through me. The clock couldn't move on its own. It couldn't be here. I grabbed a sheet from my bed and threw it over the clock, ignoring Rule 5, don't cover the clock with anything. For a brief moment, the ticking stopped. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. "Take that," I muttered, stepping back. But then the air changed. The temperature plummeted, and the smell of burnt wood grew so strong I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. The sheet over the clock began to smolder, faint wisps of smoke curling into the air. I staggered back, and the room shifted around me. The walls dissolved into darkness, stretching into an endless hallway lined with flickering candles. My feet felt heavy as I stumbled forward, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Emily." Tyler's voice echoed from somewhere ahead, faint and pleading. "Help me." I hesitated, my breath hitching. It had to be a trick. It couldn't really be him. But then I saw him. He stood at the end of the hallway, his small frame bathed in flickering candlelight. His hair was damp, his clothes soaked as if he'd just climbed out of the pool where he drowned. "Tyler?" I whispered, my voice cracking. He turned toward me, his eyes wide with fear. "Why didn't you save me?" Before I could answer, his form began to change. His body twisted and elongated, his limbs stretching unnaturally as his face dissolved into a featureless mask. The hallway around me collapsed, and I was back in my bedroom. The sheet over the clock was gone, reduced to a pile of ash on the floor. That night, I sat in the corner of my room, clutching a flashlight and staring at the clock. It didn't move again, but its ticking was relentless, a steady reminder of the rules I'd broken. The whispers continued, faint but ever-present, and every so often, I thought I saw a shadow flicker in the corner of my vision. The next day, Claire arrived as promised, her face lined with concern. "Emily, you look awful," she said, stepping inside and setting down a bag of groceries. "Have you even slept?" "Not really," I admitted, glancing at the clock in the corner. It seemed to loom larger than before, its dark wood gleaming in the sunlight. Claire followed my gaze, her brow furrowing. "Is that the clock you were talking about?" "Yeah," I said. "It's worse than I thought." I told her everything, the chimes, the whispers, the shadow, the rules I'd broken. Claire listened patiently, but her expression was skeptical. "Emily, are you sure this isn't just stress? I mean, it's a creepy clock, sure, but it's not just stress." I snapped, my voice trembling. "Look at the floor. Look at the glass." She frowned, kneeling to examine the scratches near the clock. "Okay, these are weird, I'll admit that. But maybe you're overthinking it. You've been through a lot lately, and your mind might be playing tricks on you." I didn't have the energy to argue. After Claire left, I sat on the couch, staring at the clock. I couldn't ignore the rules anymore. I couldn't pretend this wasn't real. Whatever was tied to that clock, it wasn't going to stop until it had me. And if I couldn't destroy it, I had to find a way to contain it. The house was no longer mine. It didn't matter how many lights I turned on, how much noise I made, or how many cups of coffee I drank to stay awake. The clock dominated everything. Its ticking filled every room, a constant reminder that I'd already broken too many rules. And the worst part? It was always watching me. The first time I noticed the time lapses, I thought I was just exhausted. I'd been sitting at the dining table, scrolling through old articles about haunted objects on my laptop. The last thing I remembered was glancing at the clock. It was 2:15 p.m. When I looked again, it was dark outside. 7:23 p.m. I hadn't moved, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything. It was as if the hours had simply disappeared. At first, I thought I'd dozed off, but I felt no grogginess, no sense of waking up. I'd just lost time. It happened again the next day. I woke up at 8 a.m., determined to spend the morning preparing my grandmother's diary and Grayson's notes for another visit to the library. I remember getting everything organized, sitting down with a notebook and pen. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was 3 p.m. I hadn't written a single word. Panic bubbled in my chest as I looked around the room. The clock's pendulum swung lazily, its ticking louder than ever. "Stop it," I whispered, gripping the edges of the table. The clock didn't respond, but I swore the pendulum swung just a little faster. The whispers came back that night, stronger than ever. They started faintly, almost like background noise, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, more distinct. "Emily, why didn't you save me? Help me." I pressed my hands to my ears, tears streaming down my face. "Leave me alone," I screamed. The whispers stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the time lapses, the constant ticking, it was all too much. If I was going to survive this, I needed answers. I packed up my grandmother's diary, the book from the library, and my laptop, then drove to her old house. The place was just as empty and decayed as before, but this time, I wasn't looking for her diary. I was looking for something else, something that could tie the clock's curse to my family. In the basement, I found it, an old trunk buried beneath a pile of rotting blankets. Inside were dozens of photographs, letters, and journals, all belonging to my grandmother. Many of them were mundane, pictures of family gatherings, notes about gardening, but one item stood out, a black and white photograph of a grandfather clock. It wasn't the same as mine, but it was close. The dark wood, the intricate carvings, the Roman numerals on the face, they were almost identical. On the back of the photograph, written in my grandmother's looping handwriting, were the words, "The Crawford Bellkeeper. Destroyed 1952. I flipped through the letters until I found one addressed to my mother. It was dated shortly before my grandmother's death, the ink smudged but still legible. "Dear Evelyn," it read, "if you're reading this, it means I didn't survive the clock. I tried to follow the rules, but it's not enough. The 13th chime won't leave until it gets what it wants, a sacrifice. It feeds on guilt and fear, and the only way to bind it is to offer it something it can't refuse." I sat back, the letter trembling in my hands. My grandmother had fought the same battle I was fighting now. And she'd lost. I returned home that evening, my mind racing with questions and fears. What kind of sacrifice was the letter talking about? Could I really give the clock what it wanted without losing myself? As I stepped through the door, the air inside felt heavier than usual, like a storm was brewing. The clock was waiting for me, its pendulum swinging faster than ever. That night, the whispers grew cruel. "Why didn't you save me?" Tyler's voice asked, over and over. I curled up on the couch, clutching my grandmother's diary, but the clock's presence was suffocating. Then the whispers changed. "You should have drowned instead." I froze. The words hit me like a physical blow, cutting deeper than I thought possible. My mind reeled, flashes of Tyler's face in the water filling my vision. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The clock's ticking grew louder, each sound sharp and mocking. The next morning, I made a decision. If the clock wanted a sacrifice, I'd find a way to give it one, on my terms. I wasn't going to let it win. I pored over my grandmother's diary and the library book, piecing together a ritual that combined her notes with what Grayson had told me. It required 3 items. A personal object tied to my guilt. Salt, to draw a protective circle. A bell, to disrupt the clock's power. It was a long shot, but it was the only plan I had. The personal object was easy to choose, the photograph of Tyler and me as kids, taken just a week before his death. I hadn't looked at it in years, but now, as I held it in my hands, the weight of my guilt felt unbearable. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. The clock ticked loudly behind me, as if it were listening. The ritual had to be performed at 1:13 a.m., the time the clock was most active. As the hours ticked by, the house grew colder, the air thick with the smell of burnt wood. I placed the salt, the bell, and the photograph in front of the clock, my hands trembling. The pendulum swung faster and faster, the ticking filling the room like a heartbeat. I took a deep breath and began the ritual. The house felt alive. It wasn't just the relentless ticking of the clock or the whispers that seemed to crawl through the walls. It was the way the air seemed to press against me, thick and stifling, as if the house itself was holding its breath. 1:13 a.m. was coming. And the clock was waiting. I sat cross-legged on the floor of the living room, the items for the ritual spread out in front of me, a ring of salt, a tarnished brass bell I'd found at an antique store, and the photograph of Tyler and me as children. The photo was old and faded, the edges curling slightly. Tyler's grin was wide and carefree, a stark contrast to the tight, anxious expression I wore. I couldn't look at it for too long. The air around the clock felt colder, sharper, as if it was aware of what I was about to do. I took a deep breath and lit the candle, the flame flickering weakly in the oppressive atmosphere. "Let's get this over with," I muttered, my voice shaking. The clock began to chime at exactly 1:13 a.m. The sound was low and resonant, vibrating through the floor and walls. I counted each chime aloud, my voice trembling. 1, 2, 3. As the chimes continued, the room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching and shifting along the walls. 8, 9, 10. By the 12th chime, the air was icy, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I gripped the bell tightly, my palms slick with sweat. Then came the 13th chime. The sound was deeper than the others, reverberating in my chest like the tolling of a massive church bell. The shadows around the clock began to move, coalescing into a tall, angular figure. Its form was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. Its face was a smooth, featureless void, save for two glowing eyes that burned like embers. I froze, the bell slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The figure tilted its head, studying me with an almost curious air. "Emily." The voice was soft but layered, as if a dozen voices were speaking at once. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnervingly graceful. The salt circle held it back, but just barely. The shadows around its feet licked at the edge of the barrier like flames. "You've carried this guilt for so long," it said, its voice smooth and cold. "Why not let it go?" I clenched my fists, my heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" The figure leaned forward, the shadows swirling around it. "Let me stay," it whispered. "Let me have this place, and I'll take your pain. Your guilt. All of it." For a brief, horrifying moment, I considered it. "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "You don't get to take anything from me." The entity's glowing eyes narrowed, and the room grew impossibly cold. "So be it," it hissed. The shadows surged forward, battering against the salt circle with a force that shook the floor. The candle flickered wildly, the flame shrinking with each impact. I grabbed the bell and rang it 3 times, the sound sharp and piercing. The entity recoiled slightly, its form flickering like a dying flame. I took the opportunity to reach for the photograph, holding it above the candle's weak flame. The entity froze, its glowing eyes fixed on the photo. "Don't," it said, its voice softer now, almost pleading. I hesitated, my hand trembling. The photograph was all I had left of Tyler. Destroying it felt like losing him all over again. But I didn't have a choice. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I lowered the photograph into the flame. The edges curled and blackened, the image of Tyler's face disappearing in a swirl of smoke. The entity let out a deafening scream, its form twisting and writhing as the photograph burned. The salt circle flared brightly, and the shadows began to dissolve, pulled back into the clock like water draining from a sink. The clock shuddered violently, the pendulum swinging erratically. Its ticking grew louder and louder, filling the room with a cacophony of sound. Then, with a final, deafening chime, it fell silent. The clock's face cracked, a thin line spidering across the glass. The pendulum stopped mid-swing, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. For the first time in days, the house felt still. I sat on the floor, staring at the broken clock. My hands were still shaking, the smell of burnt wood and wax lingering in the air. It was over. Or at least, I thought it was. The next morning, I woke to find the clock back in its original position in the living room. Its face was still cracked, its pendulum motionless, but it was there, its dark frame gleaming faintly in the sunlight. A folded piece of parchment sat on the floor in front of it. I picked it up with trembling hands, my stomach twisting as I read the words scrawled across it. "The 13th chime never leaves." The house was too quiet. After weeks of relentless ticking, whispering, and shadowy figures, the sudden silence was more unnerving than the noise had ever been. It felt unnatural, like the calm after a storm that promised it wasn't over. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the clock. Its pendulum was still, its face cracked, and the faint smell of burnt wood clung to the air. The note lay in my lap, the words, "The 13th chime never leaves," scrawled in an uneven hand. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd won. But deep down, I knew better. The first few days after the ritual passed uneventfully, but the unease never left. I tried to return to a normal routine, work, errands, dinner with Claire, but the clock remained, a constant reminder of everything that had happened. It didn't tick anymore, but its presence filled the room like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every time I passed it, I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck, as if something was watching me from just beyond the glass face. The dream started soon after. In the first one, I was standing in my living room, staring at the clock as its pendulum swung back and forth. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the numbers on the clock's face. When it struck 1:13 a.m., the shadows in the room came alive. They twisted and writhed, pulling me toward the clock as its chime echoed in my ears. I woke up gasping for air, my hands clutching at the sheets. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid. Sometimes, I was trapped inside the clock, the gears grinding around me as the pendulum swung dangerously close to my face. Other times, I was back in the endless hallway, the shadowy figure with glowing eyes following me no matter how fast I ran. When I woke, the room always felt colder, the shadows on the walls darker. One afternoon, I invited Claire over, desperate for company. She hadn't believed me fully before, but the sight of the cracked clock seemed to give her pause. "So, it's just stopped now?" she asked, eyeing the silent pendulum warily. "Yeah," I said, folding my arms. "But it doesn't feel gone. It's like it's waiting." Claire frowned. Waiting for what? I didn't have an answer. That evening, after Claire left, I noticed something strange. The crack in the clock's face, thin and jagged, was smaller than before. Almost as if the glass was repairing itself. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my pulse quickening. Had it always looked like that? Or was the clock undoing the damage I'd inflicted during the ritual? The idea made my stomach twist. The next night, I woke suddenly, my chest tight and my heart racing. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The house was quiet, the air still. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic ticking coming from the living room. I sat up in bed, my blood running cold. The clock wasn't supposed to be ticking. I crept into the hallway, the sound of the ticking growing louder with each step. When I reached the living room, the clock stood exactly where I'd left it, its pendulum swinging in perfect rhythm. The faint glow of the Roman numerals on its face cast eerie patterns on the walls. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. The clock struck 1:13 a.m. This time, there was no shadowy figure, no sudden drop in temperature. But as the clock chimed, I felt a strange pull, like an invisible thread tying me to the sound. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't in the living room anymore. I was back in the endless hallway, the shadows around me thick and suffocating. At the far end of the hall, the glowing eyes of the entity appeared, watching me in silence. "Emily," it whispered, the voice faint but unmistakable. I stumbled backward, clutching at my chest as the hallway dissolved around me. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the living room, the clock's ticking now faint and irregular. I stared up at its cracked face, my body trembling. The note's warning echoed in my mind, the 13th chime and never leaves. The clock wasn't just a vessel for the entity, it was a part of me now, tied to my guilt and fear. No matter what I did, no matter where I went, it would always follow. The next morning, I called Grayson. He listened in silence as I described what had happened since the ritual, his voice grim when he finally spoke. "You didn't banish it, Emily. You just bound it temporarily. The 13th chime is tied to you now. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." "And what does it want?" I asked, my throat dry. "Only you can answer that," he said. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the clock. Its pendulum was still, its face cracked but glowing faintly in the dim light. The silence was oppressive, the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on me. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't finished with me. And as the clock struck 1:13 a.m. again, I realized that I wasn't finished with it either.